All right. Welcome to a new short series. I wanted to maybe slow down in some ways and talk a little bit more about parametric CAD design. And that sounds like a fancy word, but what it's saying is um, something we experienced a lot with bathtub build, but it's building in a way where you can change one thing and it echoes or flows further into our timeline or into other relationships or features um, based on one number or one angle or one relationship and like some of our constraints. That all is connected, so it's a system that if you modify one thing, it's really powerful because it can then adjust all those other things if you've built things that kind of communicate in a certain way. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about parametric design, and in specifically um, practices in building where you can incorporate all of your different pieces like we did in the bathtub, all the different components within one design, so that when you, again, change one thing, it also changes components. So when we're talking about multi-components in an assembly, like our bathtub or like this simple wall here, the way I've drawn it and the way we built our bathtub was in a top-down method. Top-down meaning all of the components are being built together in conversation, rather than a bottom-up approach to design, which would be building all of the components in isolation, like discreetly, and then bringing them back into an assembly. That certainly is a way to work, but I think that gets us bogged down sometimes in dimensions and specifics of all those little pieces where when it comes to like telling the story of a design you want to build, so like this wall, for example, we know we have a wall that has to be a certain height, a certain shape, a certain proportion. We know that we need a certain amount of support, and so we need these frame members, for every one piece of sheetrock, and then we have to also constrain them at the top and the bottom so this thing doesn't rack or bend or fall off the wall. So that's kind of like the concept drives the design in what I think a top-down design when it functions best. So think about the concept, what we really want to achieve, and not so much about like, well, what does this piece need to look like? What does this piece need to look like? We can definitely think about those things, but come back later and kind of flush them out with details and dimensions and all those specifics. Um, so this is just a simple example. What we're going to do today, it could be anything. It could be shelves. It could be, a piece of furniture. It's pretty simple. It's mostly a two-dimensional kind of thing. As far as like, there's not a lot of crazy angles. Things are, just at 90 degrees to each other. But I think it can demonstrate this top-down design a little more. And I also want us to experience another way of changing one number that can really drive the entire design. Um, we didn't look in these parameters here when we drew our bathtub, and this looks really intimidating potentially. But what's exciting about this is this whole group of kind of gibberish looking stuff is driven just by one single number, and then a few knowns that we know about in the real world that don't change. It's like a constant. This is going to be a little bit of algebra, so forgive me, there's going to be a little bit of um, PIMDAS, if you remember from math class back in the day. So yeah, if we can get through that, I think this is going to be okay. I'm going to try to go slow and explain why I'm doing everything. I often tell people I don't like math, and that's why I learned CAD. And maybe it's I don't like, um, calculating and remembering, how to do mental math and things like that. I'm really kind of not so quick in that way. I think it's like the concepts that sometimes are exciting in building those relationships and telling those stories. So without further ado, let's jump into this. I'm going to start a new design. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this and just call it wall demo. And let's start off with just a simple sketch. Make sure we have history on. If you don't see a timeline down here, always make sure that you right click on your top component. And if it says do not capture design history, you're fine. It's sort of like whatever this is saying is about to happen if you click it. So if we click on that, we don't have history. Your defaults might be different. So when you open a new design, it might offer to capture design history. So here we are. We want to make sure we have that history. I'm going to create a new sketch, and I'm going to start with the bottommost floor member, the stud of our design. And I'm going to use a center rectangle. We can change this origin later, but right now I want to base that rectangle just off of our origin. Okay, I'm going to give it some dimensions. And I'm just actually going to just draw something that kind of looks like a 2x4, a pine stud that you just get at a big box store for, you know, not more than $3, hopefully. And just kind of roughly find a proportion, something that's skinny and then quite long. And I'm not going to worry about what these numbers are right now. It seems a little wacky and like careless. But again, this is just like sketching fast, trying to sketch proportionally, and then we're going to add dimensions. So I'm going to click Finish Sketch. That's all there is to that. Probably a good idea to start naming things. So we could call this and then let's extrude that. So I'm just going to grab that arrow and just kind of give it a little bit. Kind of looks like a 2x4 if you've seen one of those things. And then we should have a new body. Call this like floor joist, something like that. And now let's start with a vertical member that is going to be the first one on our left here. So I'm going to create a new sketch. I'm going to make sure I use that top plane of that last piece we just drew, that new body. And I'm going to do a 2-point rectangle. And I know I want this to be flush on one end. And it's going to be aligned on this width, but also flush on that edge. So it's going to kind of be a similar profile going up. And then we can extrude that. We want to make sure we have a new body selected. Make sure if you drag, there we go. If you drag this arrow, it might default to operation join. Make sure it's operation in a new body. I'm going to zoom out some. And it's going to be quite high, something like that. We can change these dimensions later, of course. All right, so 2 pieces, cool. I want to go ahead and finish out that top, that header, that joist that's going to be across this other way. If any of my terminology is off, it's quite possible. You know, never was a trained carpenter, but have built some walls in my life. So if I'm calling the wrong thing, comment below, we'll fix it. Okay, so I want to mirror this horizontal member across the midplane that we just created by drawing this vertical stud. So first thing I'm going to do, we need to create some construction geometry. I'm going to hide that floor joist, go to construct, midplane, and we're going to select one end and the other end, and we should end up with a midplane. We'll click OK. We could call that and then let's bring our horizontal piece, the floor joist, we're calling it, back, and we're going to see mirror. If you don't see mirror up here, you can click create, mirror, and pattern type bodies. We'll select that bottom piece, and our mirror plane is that plane we just made. And let's change this to I guess it's not technically the ceiling potentially, but okay. Before we go any further, I'm going to turn these into components. So one thing we can do, I'm going to hold down Shift and click on the first one, and then click on the last one, or you can hold down Control and just select multiple at a time. And then we can right click and go to create components from bodies. It's going to make our lives easier when we make changes to one thing. Those changes will echo throughout, as well as some of our naming conventions will hopefully get, carried through further, so we can kind of keep track of things. Okay, this wall is not going to stand up very well. It's obviously going to collapse if we try to put weight on it. So let's add more of these vertical studs. We want 1, 2, 3, 4 across. We're going to start with like a module that would support one piece of sheetrock. I find when I know I need to build walls and it's time to go to the store, I like thinking in like kind of like a module, and then if I need to estimate for a little bit more, we can build that in. We'll hopefully get there today. So we're going to go to create pattern, rectangular pattern. Make sure we have components selected here. My object is going to be that vertical stud. Direction, we could select the piece here itself, but I would rather grab that origin. So let's hide that and make sure we're just actually on this part of the axis of our origin. We can bring that back now. So next question is, do we want our distance type to be the extent or the spacing between? So extent means the distance between here and here, or excuse me, here and here. Let's go ahead and make that quantity. We know we want 4. And let's just go ahead and look at these numbers just to really see the difference between extent and spacing. So right now, our extent, it says that distance is 4.3 inches. If we change this to spacing, let's see, it's divided by 3. 1, 2, 3. 4 pieces. 1, 2, 3 spaces. We're going to need to remember that kind of relationship later. And then we don't need any in the other direction. So we want this on spacing. If we have it on extent, we can always change it back later. I'll go ahead and put it on extent just in case we forget that, and we can look at it later. This suppress, that just gives you the option. If that's checked, you can like mute, we'll call it mute certain of these. Don't need it. You can leave it on or off. Just don't suppress anything because we need all of them. All right. And you can see we got these carried out the same names from when we had vertical studs. So that's good. Keeps things nice and clear. Okay, so it kind of looks like a wall. We could go ahead and do the sheetrock, but I want to wait on that. I think it'll be simpler once we get things kind of built out. So we didn't add any dimensions, so this is sort of like a little messy. Let's now think about what those dimensions are. I think the first thing to do would be to define better the anatomy of a 2x4. And if you've ever measured a 2x4, it is not 2 inches by 4 inches in cross section. It's a little different. So let's enter in these values. I'm going to go up to change parameters. If you don't see this here, it's going to be modify down towards the bottom. I've pinned it to the toolbar because we're going to be using it a lot. There isn't a shortcut, but you could make a shortcut for it. So we're going to be clicking on that a whole lot. I'm going to move this over to one side so we can see it while we add some things. So already before we add anything, we can see that there's already parameters existing in our model. If I open up our model parameters here with the component name, we can see we have parameters that are already built in. So we can see even without like programming anything or adding any values here in this chart, we've actually done a lot of it already. When we added dimensions, we went ahead and actually created these. So there's our first dimension, our length and our width. But let's define them. We can either define them on the sketch, but some of these values we want to use in multiple places. We have many studs with the same 2x4 profile, so we don't want to enter in that number again and again and again. We can reference that same constant many, many times, pulling from the same place to many destinations, if you want to think of it that way. So where it says user parameters, I'm going to hit that plus. And first we want to come up with a name. I would come up with a naming convention that makes sense to you. I'm going to do something that is just a habit of naming things because it visually works for me. But you can see this, the way Fusion pulls your parameters is actually quite handy. You can just kind of search as you type in letters or numbers. So I'm going to call first, we'll call it width. Just going to give some space with a underscore there. And we are going to be using units in this case. If we open this up, we can see we have length units. And if we scroll down, we have angle units, currencies, current, luminosity, mass, percentage, pieces, substrate. So many things like magnetizing field. Wow. If you know how to use that, if you know what that means, this could be really exciting. I'm length, width, maybe volume, maybe weight are the kinds of things that I might be using. If you wanted to price something out too, you could use this as kind of like an estimate sheet. If you wanted to kind of anticipate what your project was going to cost if you had those knowns. And we can do that too in this project. So let's stick with inches for now. The width of our 2x4 is going to be 3.5, or you could say 3. If you don't like decimals, you can type in the fraction. Just make sure that between the integer and the fraction, the whole number and the fraction, if it's a mixed number like we have here, you have an addition between the two. So 3 plus 1.5, we can see is 3.5. Again, don't insult anyone's intelligence with the math lesson, but I also don't want to be kind of overwhelming folks with this kind of stuff. So click OK. Just like to show alternatives rather than memorizing decimals. I'm all against memorizing stuff. Okay, that's the width of our 2x4. Let's go ahead and make the thickness of the 2x4. Now we could call this height, I guess, if you're thinking about a cross section, but I'm going to call it thick 2x4, and that's going to be 1.5 or 1/2. I'm also going to go ahead and write length of 2x4. We'll just think in standard what a 2x4 comes in. This can come in handy later if we don't end up using it now. And if you don't remember how many inches go into a full 8-foot 2x4, you can type in 8, and you can either type in feet, maybe not, FT works, or if you know the symbols, it's just the little apostrophe, 8 apostrophe, or 8 feet, which is 96 in our unit, which is inches. I'm using inches because it's just something that I speak better. You could use feet, but since some of the things we're doing are small, I like to think in inches, and converting between feet and inches is pretty easy in Fusion. So there's our basic 2x4 anatomy. So maybe we can plug that in, and this will start taking a little bit more realistic shape, and we'll see what happens to the model as those parameters echo into our timeline. So first thing, open up our first sketch, and let's come find our first sketch dimensions, our kind of looking down profile. So this is going to be our width. So if I type in width, type it in correctly, or just type in WI, we can see it's going to give us any parameters that have that combination of letters in it. So you don't even have to remember the exact name of something. If you leave yourself like a breadcrumb trail of you know, the concept, if you know it's a width and you don't remember what is after that, or if you remember it's a 2x4 but you don't remember if you called it width or not, you can have a little bit of that information and move forward. So just make sure it makes sense to you. It doesn't have to be these things. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click OK. Okay, it doesn't look like what we wanted to anymore, but let's go ahead and change this one to length 2x4. Okay, it's probably going to go way off the screen because it's scaled very differently now, so I'm going to go back to fit here. And that looks bizarre. Let's go to our thickness of our 2x4. That's this first extrude. Double click on it, or right click, edit feature, and I'm going to call this thick 2x4. Cool. It's a little weird we have a big piece in there, but we will get into this. So let's go to our next sketch, vertical stud. Okay, this looks strange. So yeah, I think what was happening is we have all of these overlapping pieces. The way that was unconstrained, it just kind of did its thing. Remember, in this view mode, or in this environment, and then when I talk about environments, I mean down here, or in this photo booth environment, if anything shows up as blue in a sketch, that means it's unconstrained and it can move around. So we want to constrain it. We've already constrained the width because our bottom piece, it's matching that because we have this coincident constraint here and here on our rectangle, and the rest of the rectangle is defined. So we want to dimension the relationship between here and here. If we try to just dimension this line, it's going to say this will over-constrain the sketch, and we'll choose OK to create a driven sketch rather than a driving dimension. You can see it shows up in parentheses. So 3.5, so that makes sense. So how do we then do this one to this one, relate this line to that line? So let's click on both, 1 and, come on computer, 2. So that's clearly way too thick. So let's bring that thickness back, and this should start looking a little more reasonable. Okay, our heights and everything are a little wacky. It's very short. Let's change that extrude. So I'm just gonna, let's not think about how a wall should be, but let's just kind of think about how the 2x4s come. So if I forgot what it's called, let's just type in 2x4 and we can see we get all 3 possibilities. Let's choose length. Oh, try that again. I don't know why it's giving me a 2 in the front. There we go. Weird. Okay. Yeah, just make sure there's nothing else in there, because you can also do math inside of these. All of these are potentially parameters. Notice also we can drop down and we can see recently added things. So do that. Okay. Now there's a lot of strength on the left side of this, but we need to spread these out. So our spacing is not quite right yet. You can see our top piece has their correct dimensions. If we just want to check that, we can go to inspect, measure, and if I click on the top edge and the bottom edge, you should see, come on, there we go, 1.5. If we click on, let's restart that selection, click on one side and the other side, you should see 3.5. So because we did that mirror, we didn't have to redimension that piece. That's another relationship or constraint, another parameter. Maybe I could find a better word than parameter if that's kind of like not a fun one. Let's now change our pattern and add some of those parameters. We haven't added any yet. So we've just added in random numbers here. Maybe not random, we've chosen 4 and we've chosen distance. Let's talk about that distance. Right now, we haven't added a parameter, but commonly kind of a section of wall that has, you know, a piece of sheetrock in it, you can't see through it when it's time to like add screws, or if you need to hang something, you know, artwork or a shelf or something. Often we're kind of looking for, in most homes built with wooden studs, we're looking for a stud every 16 inches on center, because we don't have x-ray vision, and stud finders are sort of like divining rods. It's good to have, you know, a standard. Not all houses, and I've been in a lot of houses that don't have a 16 on center standard, or there's areas where that spacing just doesn't work out. But we want to try to build our module to that standard. So let's say spacing and that's going to be a unit of inches, and we'll call it 16. Okay, let's go back to our rectangular pattern and change that distance to spacing. Now, this is where extent and spacing makes a big difference. Obviously, we know we want spacing. If we have extent, that means from here to here, it's 16 inches. If we change that to spacing, we'll need to change that distance again, it looks like. Okay, that looks a little more reasonable. Now, this length is a little too long, I'd say. For a module, our piece of sheetrock is going to be 4 feet by 8 feet, so we're not going to use the entire stud for a module. Now, when you're building a wall, you probably will, but we just want to think about it in kind of a piece at a time. We can make this smarter in the future. So let's add a few more parameters. Let's now create a new parameter that's talking about how many studs we want, because we want to maybe be able to control the length based on the quantity, or the quantity based on the length is kind of maybe an ultimate goal. So now is where changing the unit is really important, that we do it here and now. Where it says unit inches, we want to change that to no units. And let's make that 4. And let's go back to our rectangular pattern. And now we can change this to our parameter. Click OK. Nothing really changes here, but we can see we have a parameter in this. Click OK. So now if we change that, I'm going to bring this over so we can see it to one side. We can make this 5. Love it when it doesn't work. There we go. Okay, so now you can see it's a good thing to test this kind of every step of the way too, just to make sure things are connecting. So you can see when I change that number, things are changing, but that length isn't really changing. So let's think about what that length really should be. Let's go ahead and call this length wall. And let's just say 48. And let's come down here and change, rather than that stud length in our first dimension, we'll come and find this sketch and double click, and we can change this to length, not the 2x4, but the wall. You can see that's shorter now. So 48 sounded good. It was kind of like half of a full stud, and it would be the width of our piece of sheetrock. But there's a problem with doing that, is that if the width of our module is exactly the width of the sheetrock, when it's time to add another piece of sheetrock on, an adjoining portion of the wall, you don't have any overlap onto the stud to then put a screw through. So we need to add a little bit of something to this. So we need to add the thickness of a stud, it looks like. And that'll bring us all the way to the end. So rather than changing this, because we can't really speak to the edge here to here, we could add an extrude command or extrude feature to the end here, like that. But I'd rather go back to like the story and not just kind of like, this would be like kind of fixing a symptom rather than fixing the kind of structure. So let's do a structural change here. So back to parameters, and let's create a new parameter. I'm going to leave that length wall, and we'll call this length wall, call it corrected. Sure, no judgment, but it's corrected. And then we're going to use some of the information we have here to make this smart. Okay, so we'll have the length of the wall. And we're going to add, it's our first kind of piece of math we're doing, we're going to add the thickness of a 2x4. And let's click OK. And you can see we get a new number, 49.5. Nothing changed over here because we need to go change it. Now, if going back to the sketch is sort of annoying, we could also come find that sketch in here in our model parameters, and we could find that stud floor sketch, and we could then change this to, instead of length wall, we could call it length wall corrected. So we could do this without even going back to the model. We hit OK. You can see that's 49.5, and now it's flush to the edge. Very cool. So let's think about what is variable in our model. We can change the number of studs, and we can change the wall length. Okay, sometimes if we just kind of think about multiples, we can end up with nice round numbers. But I can also just kind of make things up, and we might end up with like, this kind of gappiness or incompletion, if you want to think of it that way. Let's just change this back to some of those, just what ended up working to a nice 4 width quantity. But let's have the quantity and the length be in better conversation. So we could have the length of the wall driven by the quantity, but that seems a little strange. We could have this as, let's look at it and see how that works. The quantity of the vertical studs times the spacing of the vertical studs. Okay, now that's too long. It's almost one whole spacing of 2x4 too long. So again, remember, if we have 4 items and we're thinking about the spacing in between, we really have 1, 2, 3 spaces. So we're thinking about the spaces. So let's add a little bit of extra math here. So we've done multiplication. Remember, we've got our order of operations. So we need to add some parentheses because we want to then subtract 1 from this. So let's add parentheses around it. Let's see, why is it not liking that? Oh, because I've got just a random letter in there. Cool. So when it turns black, it'll let us do it. So now we can see if we change the number of studs, it'll change the wall, and it'll always end up being flush because we've determined that length based off of the ratio of studs per wall length. But again, if we're in a room and we measure, our tape measure doesn't say how many studs is that wall need to be. It's how many inches or how many feet. Got a fire truck passing through here. Probably pick that up. Okay, so that's not really the story we want to tell. Let's make this back to just a number, and let's make this reasonable again. So we want to determine the quantity based on the wall length. So let's think about that. Let's go to here, quantity, and let's say length of wall divided by 16. So kind of the inverse relationship. Now it's not letting us do that. Now, why is it not letting us do it? Let's see if we can get that error back. So it says we have a unit mismatch between 1 and numbers are kind of confusing. But what it's saying is we're trying to use a linear dimension and then a unitless dimension, a quantity. So our units are mismatched. So this is where Fusion gets a little, let's call it goofy. But there's a workaround. You know, I love a workaround. So we can convert this dimension, this length of our wall, to a quantity. So we'll call this, first thing I want to do, we'll give it a name, length wall, let's call it unitless. First of all, change the unit to no units. I want to make sure that's there right off the bat. And let's call it length wall. And we're just going to divide it by 1. It still is red. So how do we change this? Divide it by inches. Divide it by 1 inch. And that gives us a whole number that, or in this case, a whole number that is unitless. So let's go back here. Let's say length of our wall, that's unitless, divided by 16. Maybe we need to change a little something there. We need to add 1, because that's our 3 gaps. So we need to add that 4th, because now we're talking about pieces, not gaps. So we're just going to tack on a 1 at the end. That was pretty easy. And just show that again. So that was what we got. Not enough pieces here. We're just going to add 1. And because of PEMDAS, parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division. Division comes first, and then addition, we don't need parentheses around our division here. Okay, so that's something. We kind of have this working where we can change this, but it's always going to kind of end up with this tail. So maybe there's a way we can round this up a little bit. Also, even though we're getting a mixed number here, or not a whole number, I'd like to just look at that as a whole number, and rather than a decimal, because we really should be looking at, we can't have, in this sense, we can't have 0.6875 of a stud. So some of these things that I'm typing in, you know, are they just math operations? You know, on the keyboard, you've got plus, minus, multiplication, divide. But if we go to, I hope I didn't lose all that just then. Okay, that's good. All right, if we go to our Autodesk page, under the kind of Fusion 360 manual, there's a parameters dialog box page, and we can see there's actually a way to round. If we go down here into the syntax of the functions, you can also see just a review on our PEMDAS here operations. We come down, there's a round. Okay, it's going to take us to the closest whole number. And then if we want to be a little more specific, we can round up the next highest whole number or the next lowest whole number. So floor and ceiling, I think, are what we're talking about, which maybe is a little confusing for our example that we're working on. But that's okay. Maybe even kind of extra appropriate. So let's round down, because we don't want an extra. We want to make sure we have just enough in this case. So floor is a little strange because we have the words floor floating around other places, and we need a parentheses around whatever we're rounding. If we hit enter, now we should get a whole number here. And let's just go back to that page just so we can see round, ceiling, floor. Okay, cool. Yeah, but we want this to be a little uh, smarter, I suppose. Okay. When we start to add numbers that don't quite add up, if we have, less than that 16 or more than that 16, we don't want things that trail. So let's add to this correction, let's add a little bit of um, smartness. Call back to our corrected. We're still going to think about the thickness of this 2x4. So let's add some stuff before it. Let's say our quantity of our stud -1. So we're talking about the gap. And then we can multiply that by the spacing. Okay, we've probably got to clean this up. We need parentheses around our operations. Okay, now it's black. It looks like it's going to accept that. And we hit enter. Now it's clean that up a bit. So we also have a mixed number here. Let's just try some numbers, plug some new numbers in. Okay, so you can see even if we're over, excuse me, that 48 that we were using before, nothing's changing because we are dividing and we're ending up with a multiple of 16 kind of always. So we're not really taking, when we're looking at the length of the wall corrected, we're not looking at the floor length that we have here, the length of the wall. We're really looking at the quantity of studs, which we've defined here, which is defined by the floor length, but it's divided by 16. It's divided by that spacing. And then we're adding again the thickness of that 2x4. And we're accounting for the spaces, so we're subtracting one. If this subtraction addition, you could also make new parameters or variables that have that built in. You could have like a stud gap parameter, if that made more sense. So let's see where we're at. Okay. That looks pretty good. Let's just, type in some, maybe not that big, but just type in some long numbers and just see. That looks like if we test it, things are working out. So happy with that for now. Let's click OK. And now let's talk about our sheetrock. So we've got all of our components existing for now for these studs. Let's create a new sketch. And I'm going to make that new sketch. You can either do it on this board or this board. Either way, we want to make sure we follow along and getting the right projected dimensions in a moment. We'll leave that sketch running. And I'm going to make sure I really want this, the distance between here and here, projected. So you can click P on the keyboard. Or you can go to project include, project, click OK. And now I'm going to make a point between there and there. Now if that's hard to see, we get this triangle, and that's going to be our midpoint. We want the midpoint between here and here. Okay, just before, just to review, I'm making a new sketch. And if we tried to add that point before, if we started our sketch down here, we wouldn't have this line from here to here projected. So we first have to project that. If you're lucky, maybe you zoom in and you can just grab that line, but you can click on the face and you'll project the whole rectangle. You can see we've projected the whole rectangle there. So let's add that point like that. And let's just make a rectangle out in space and dimension it out. We'll call it 8 feet. by 4 feet. Should be getting my keystrokes down there. Don't know what's going on with that. I'll try to explain the keystrokes when I do them. Okay, and let's now put this on the face. So I want to think about the bottom of the sheetrock. Hopefully, if our ground is level and everything is kind of nice and square and plumb, we want the bottom of our sheet of sheetrock to be just about, if not exactly on the bottom of our stud there. So let's create a collinear constraint. Click on the bottom of our sheetrock and come down and find the bottom here. If you don't have that line, you'll need to project it first. So create project include project, click on that line, and now you should be able to go back to collinear, click, click. Let's curvature, not collinear. Okay, we're not quite there yet. We still have some blue lines, which means this is still a flexible sketch. So we want this point to be coincident with, excuse me, this vertical line. So let's go to constraints, coincident. I'm going to click on that point and then click on this line, and it should snap on over. And we can see it's solid black. We can't drag it around anymore because we've defined things. We defined 2 locations and then our 2 dimensions. So location meaning this bottom and then this distance from left to right. Allergies are bad today. It is spring here in Richmond. And let's go to finish sketch. We're going to extrude this out now. So back to extrude. And we want to make sure we take the whole sheet. If we end up with like a piece missing, just really check and make sure you're getting that full rectangle. And let's say, well, let's just drag it out. Let's not worry about dimensions. Well, that's surprising. There we go. That was a very odd glitch. Make sure we have new body, or even better, new component selected. All right, and we will go to just name some things, and let's name this. Okay, that's a massive piece of sheetrock. Good luck getting that through a door. Let's go to our parameters and let's give this some better information. So let's call width. Now these are pretty constant. It's probably not going to change, but I just like to get in the habit of adding parameters when I've started to, just so it feels like that story is complete. And if it does change, if you're maybe are in another country where inches aren't being used, you could then have these, you could just change the numbers in this page and everything would follow suit. And then our thickness. Sheetrock comes in lots of different thicknesses, so maybe, you know, depending on your project, that could change too. We're going to stick with 1/2 inch. And we could come in here and change all this stuff, but let's practice changing it here. So let's come find our sheetrock sketch. Let's change this to length. Oops. Here's where we need to change it. Length, sheetrock, width, sheetrock. So this is just the name of that dimension from our sketch. It's not the name of the parameter. And you can see nothing changed here. But then let's go to, since we made this component, it's going to show up as its own hierarchy. So we have wall demo, and then we have sheetrock because it's its own sheetrock. Since we did that extrude as make a component instead of a new body, let's open that up. And we don't need to change the taper angle. That should be just the same. Let's change this down here where a long distance. Let's change that to thickness of sheetrock. And when we hit enter, that should change to 1/2 inch. So that looks pretty good. Okay, Now, something is a little strange. So we've got a lot of extra stud kind of floating up above our sheetrock, and that's not going to make such a easy wall. You know, if you're adding some trim or some very massive trim, maybe we could get away with that, but we really want these vertical studs cut to a different height. So let's go back to change parameters, and let's call the new one length. Actually, we're going to make this 92 and 5. Okay, so there's our new length. That's kind of a standard. And let's come find the extrusion where we made that. And right now we had length of 2x4. That's fine. We can still use that later, but here we want this to be length of vertical stud. Okay, great. So 92 and 5/8. We've got a little bit of sheetrock hanging off the top. All right, so let's go back to playing with some numbers here. I'm going to change our length. And if finding these every time is kind of difficult, let's click on this star, because this is one of those numbers that we want to change. So we don't want to have to dig in here. We want to kind of pin this to the favorites. So if we make this 90, what happens? So we don't get more sheetrock. If we make this 96, what happens? We don't get more sheetrock. Why not? Because we haven't patterned that. We haven't told Fusion that we're going to want more pieces of sheetrock every time we make more studs. So let's go ahead and make a pattern for this. Let's go to rectangular pattern, components, that's good. Let's take our sheetrock, and where it says directions, we want to do this the same way we did the stud pattern. Let's make sure we're going off of the origin. Bring that back now. And let's just make this quantity 2. We know we want that to be quantity 2. And this we can drag around and check it out. Again, we know we want spacing set here. And then we want this to be, we don't even need to make a new parameter. We can make this width of sheetrock, because we want those to be flush every time we make a new wall or new part of the wall. We don't want any gaps there. And we'll click OK. But if we keep making this wall bigger and bigger and bigger, we're not getting more because we don't have a parameter for the quantity of the sheetrock. And we'll call this Unitless. And let's think about what we want our quantity to be. So the sheetrock really, I think, is in most conversation with the studs rather than the length of the wall, because we know we need a certain amount of stud to support that sheetrock. So let's make this our vertical stud quantity. And let's see if we divide that by 4. Let's see what happens there. And let's go back to our pattern. Make our quantity our sheetrock quantity. Click OK. Make sure that's okay. It's giving me red here. It's a little annoying. Oh, I have an idea of why. Okay, so we don't have an integer. We have a mixed number. We don't have a whole number, if you want to think of it that way. Let me see if we can do it here. We make this pattern. Maybe we can get some more information. So I found the pattern where we're spacing out the sheetrock. Okay, it took it there. It's weird. So there's it. Now it's 3 because we don't have a full of the next wall. What if we make this divided by 3? There we go. So we really should have had enough to fill 4 pieces. So again, we're back to the spaces, not the gaps, rather than the full studs. So at a 200-inch wall, we're actually at 193.5. And then I'm going to put this corrected. I'm going to pin this up here too, because that's what we've corrected it to. And then we have 13 vertical studs. Seems off, but okay. And then we've got, this really probably should be also a, whoops, round down. And then we have that as a whole number. That's more reasonable. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's keep playing with this. Let's change the length. I'm going to look at it from the back so we can just keep an eye on everything. Let's bring this back down to a small. Let's make this something big. So things look like they're flush. If we zoom in, things are flush. We've got, you know, a gap for the next piece of sheetrock to lay on there on either side. So I think the way we've driven this is pretty cool. Now we could take this further to build our like estimate list, see how many studs we'll need and how many pieces of sheetrock we'll need. It might be an easy count for some things, but the way we've drawn our top and bottom, studs are not how wood comes. You can't get 100 or a 289-inch long piece of pine these days. So let's first, let's come up with just a count of the vertical studs, or we'll call it needed. How many of those horizontal studs do we need? Vertical studs, we'll start with the verticals. And this should just be the same as quantity vertical studs. We want to make sure that's a no unit, unitless. So we've got our number here. The number still seems weird. And then let's come up with our horizontal. Again, we're going to do a quantity, and let's think about how we want to define this. So we want to take the length, and we want to divide that by the length of a full length stud. So let's see if we can do that. Let's do a length to the length of the wall divided by length 2 by 4. Okay, there's a number. That seems like a very weird number for what we have. We know it should be an even number, in fact. So it's saying we need 3 1/8 studs. So we know we're going to need a little bit more. So let's go ahead and round up. So we know that's going to be seal. We go back to that help menu, or the help page in Autodesk. So this should round up to 4 now. Because we know if we need 1/8 of a board, we're going to need the entire thing to cut it. You can't buy 1/8 of a board usually, unless you got some friends at Home Depot. But that's really only for the top piece. So we need to multiply that by 2. Because we need 1 for the top, 1 for the bottom. And now we could make this a unit. And we should be able to take needed plus needed. And let's pin this to the top. So we know we need 27. Still seems like an odd number. 1, 2, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Very well. Okay. Okay, so we need 27 studs from the store. We'll have some leftovers potentially. Just looking at the way we had a remainder there, we round it up. Let's do the same thing with the sheetrock. So you could just add quantity sheetrock, but I like to put things in kind of the same language. That's a little obsessive, but okay, we can pin that to the top. And let's say, let's change this to something where we have a little bit that we still need to buy a piece of sheetrock to cover that, because we don't have like a full module, we just have a little bit more. We've done that in a smart way with our studs. Let's then round this up, because we don't want to just add one here, because that would always be wasteful. Let's go back to the source and let's round that up. So we'll have a little bit hanging over in our model, but if we're using this model for like planning rather than modeling, this could be helpful. So we're kind of in the planning stage now, like the estimate stage, and you could save this template for future projects too. So let's go back to quantity of sheetrock. Instead of floor, let's make that seal. Okay, so there it is. We've got a piece that's hanging over, and now that should change our number to really reflect what we need. So now let's price this out. We need to maybe come up with some numbers here. We're about at 3 o'clock, but I want to just see currency. Okay, currency, doll. Let's call it price per stud. I'm gonna make up some numbers here. 325. So we should be able to say just trying to keep it with the same convention. We'll multiply that by interesting. Start over there. Oh, I know why, because we need to be in dollars. Yeah. Total times price. That should do it now. Cool. And let's pin that to the top. Let's see, we've got sheetrock and our, so we know we need, I wonder if I can lead that with a $sign. I bet not. I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, it's not Google Sheets after all. Okay, but we know we're probably going to spend $40 on studs. We can do the same thing with sheetrock. I'm not going to show you because I think it's pretty self-evident at that point. But yeah, I think now you can like play with this if you want to try to break it. Still getting an extra piece there. So it looks like, yeah, maybe that isn't quite doing what we need. Maybe it's got to be, when we're doing this rounding business, let's go back to our sheetrock. Okay, so I've now done that -1. Maybe we need to think about the spacing rather than the numbers. And maybe this actually, yeah, let's bring it back to 47. Okay, that looks more reasonable. Yeah, okay. I'm just trying some new numbers here. Let's call it 60. Okay, yeah, that looks more reasonable. Cool. Okay, so there's a little bit about parameters and how you can change one number and it affects so many different things. What I want us to look at on Wednesday is something completely different. We're going to talk more about materials in the render workspace, and we're going to actually open up Photoshop. I can show you maybe some other ways to do it too. Um, but we're going to make custom physically based materials to really give this the look of a piece of sheetrock that's been taped and floated, but maybe not painted yet. You want to kind of have that, give it that raw look. We can play with different materials there, plugging in custom things into Fusion's render workspace, um, and even talking about maybe the sense of realism where you maybe even want to show like where the screws are and things like that. Something that's not perfect. Kind of back to the end of our bathtub uh, exploration was like giving it a messiness is like a way to help give it some realism if you had like an assembly of these that you wanted to show in a room. So that'll be Wednesday. Thanks for hanging out today. I know it's a lot of math stuff, but I think once we just get a little bit of our PIMDAS going, um, it should make a lot of sense. It's nothing that's like, we're not talking about like trigonometry or exponents or logarithms or any of that kind of stuff. So I hope this is followable. This is something that I think is kind of really exciting, actually. This doesn't just have to be a boring wall. It could be, cabinets that you're trying to figure out how many cabinets you need for a room, or how many shelves you want. If you have to put a certain, dimension of thing on a shelf, you need to know how many shelves you could fit on a wall. Stuff like that, I think, could be really interesting rather than just kind of trial and error. I think this can show you kind of what works pretty immediately if you get that system down. And you can see it takes some tuning and a little bit of like fussing, kind of problem solving. But I think this could be a great template for thinking about these things in the future too. So see you Wednesday. Thanks again.